Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. We are those people. I'm Mike Baudendistel, head of Intermodal Solutions here, joined as usual by Joanna Marsh, who does editorial writing at FreightWaves. Joanna, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. Enjoying the cooler weather. And how are things with you?
All right, not cooler weather here, 104 today in Dallas.
Mm.
Thank you for arranging the interview last week. So, for those who didn't see last week's episode, Joanna Marsh arranged an interview with DeAndre Larry, who is the head of intermodal at Uber Freight, and had a good discussion with DeAndre. You could go back and view that episode on the FreightWaves YouTube channel or on the Freightcast network. And to me, the sort of interesting thing, sort of takeaway was, he came away from Norfolk Southern, long tenure at Norfolk Southern, came over to Uber Freight, intrigued by the prospects of sort of the growth opportunity in intermodal in Uber Freight. And I kept trying to, get him to throw out some, capacity constraint that he sees on the horizon in the intermodal network. And he kept saying they didn't see any intermodal capacity constraint, that they're going to have the intermodal capacity in place. So I thought, that was interesting. And also thought that was interesting is they're planning, I asked him if there's going to be a peak season, and he said they're planning for a peak season in terms of having the capacity in place, having the containers available, all of those things. They don't own containers themselves; they're sourcing those from third parties, but sort of have that available. And then another thing he said that was interesting was rail service. Has been good. Anytime speak with someone who's involved with intermodal, always like to ask them, how the rail service is. So he's complimentary on that. And then one thing that surprised me was actually from a white paper that FreightWaves and Uber Freight did together. I have a graphic on that, shows some blue bars that show how companies prioritize factors when deciding between intermodal and traditional truckload. And so the low scores are the most important, and the higher scores are the least important. And so it shows the highest scores, where it's the most important, is emissions. And then the least important is cost, down at 4.7 out of 5. Emissions was a 2 out of 5. So it's kind of counter to what I would have expected. Like if I would have guessed, I would have guessed that cost would have been the most important thing, because you sort of think of intermodal, sort of the reason for it existing is it's 10 to 15% cheaper than rail, or 10 to 15% cheaper rail intermodal, 10 to 15% cheaper than full truckload. When you include the fact there's lower fuel surcharge on intermodal, to me that was sort of the most important thing. And then from there, I would have guessed service, which is a combination of those maybe middle bars: visibility, safety, transit time, on-time delivery. And I would have guessed, emissions was maybe at the bottom, but we do hear from more and more CPGs and specifically CPGs that want to show that they're doing well with carbon, and are looking for ways to improve the emissions. So I thought all that was interesting. Thank you for arranging that, and also want to get into talking about your most recent article that you published on FreightWaves earlier today. It has to do with CSX, and so Rail Union calls for more extensive conductors following two deaths, unfortunately. Training in the railroads being rushed. Some of the calls from the union heads, specifically at Smart TD, which represents the conductors there. So, what can you tell us about this situation at CSX?
Yeah, so it is an unfortunate situation. So I guess you kind of have two things going on, really. You have the individual situation at CSX, and then you sort of have that broader look at how training is being conducted. And so I guess with CSX first, they're the first fatality occurred, I think, in late June or early July, and then several weeks after that, CSX and Smart TD announced that since Smart TD is the union representing train conductors, that they would be working together on sort of beefing up CSX's training program for conductors, adding an extra week. And then you had a second fatality happen in Maryland, and then after that, CSX said that it would be said it had called its conductor trainees back to their home terminals for additional training. So you have that individual issue going on with CSX. The larger issue, though, about whether the training that's happening now is sufficient. That's where Smart TD is weighing in with its advisory, kind of telling, you know, I felt the main message was, and it sounds so simple, but maybe when you're in sort of the heat of the situation, it's harder. If you don't feel safe, then stop operations. I guess regardless of what that ramification might be. Obviously, because you don't want anything bad to happen to you or your colleagues. So you have that, and then you also have the Federal Railroad Administration issuing its own safety bulletin, which isn't something enforced, but it was something that they felt compelled to write, which was telling the Class 1 railroads. Well, actually, didn't mention the Class 1 railroads specifically, but telling the freight railroads to look at how shoving movements are conducted in the yards, and to ensure that you know that conductors and others aren't put into danger. When you when one piece of equipment gets close to another piece of equipment, so nothing bad happens from that. And then I think I've heard offhand. I don't really have any sort of data to back this up, so it's more sort of qualitative. You see on social media union members kind of just talking about like how they feel that training could be more extensive than that's being offered now. And I think you have you had a lot of pressure in the recent months and years about trying to get those crew numbers up, but then you have but then, and it makes sense. I mean, you have union members saying that it takes years of experience to really sort of understand the nuances involved in operating a train, and so having someone new involved in training someone else new might not be the best situation for either person. So it's actually, so the FRA advisory was talking about in a way kind of vetting who is training the trainees. As long, sorry. But
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it seems like a kind of a big issue. I mean, it's like you said. I mean, they brought in a lot of people here, lately, and it's been a big push to get those numbers up. And so, my understanding always historically was that it took like 6 months to train conductors. But then in the last like year or two, I started hearing more like it takes like 4 to 6 months. Sort of, it almost seemed like that range was reduced. So to me, I was wondering, whether there was, reduction in the amount of training time, just because the railroads, they had blamed all of these issues on all these service issues on not having the personnel. There was this big push to get people in the door. Sort of makes sense that they might want to cut some corners in terms of training. And then the unions also blamed, PSR. So did that make any sense to you?
well, I think it's kind of one of perhaps maybe, and this is my own personal opinion, probably more indirectly, in the sense that I think PSR might have contributed to creating an environment where low morale was kind of
Mhm.
I think I think to some degree, and I could be wrong with this, but I think there's always going to be some grumbling, but I think PSR contributed to that low morale, which kind of led to people leaving the the industry, and then I think maybe perhaps um, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I think that that pressure to get to certain places at a certain time, and just to sort of be on the clock about like how how fast
Mhm.
how fast, but just making sure that you sort of that you are aligned, aligned with the schedule. It just kind of feeds the beast in a way. So but I know that that's I think it's well known that the PSR is not a the unions aren't a fan of that operating method. So
Yeah, I mean, potentially they could have had a
mhm.
more experienced workforce,
Mhm.
without PSR, because those people they furloughed during the pandemic, maybe they would have been more likely to come back. They didn't need to train as many people. So potentially, like indirectly, is maybe the right word that you used. Want to move on to the next topic here, which is I thought there were some pretty significant takeaways from an investor meeting last week. JB Hunt's president of Intermodal, Darren Field, presented at one of the Wall Street conferences. I think it might have been Wells Fargo. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but Darren said they don't see any evidence of a peak season in intermodal. If I could boil it down to one line, and he's just not hearing from a lot of customers that they're going to have a lot of outsized needs this fall. For extra capacity, and also hearing just really a lot of mixed things from the big shippers that they haul for. Some of the shippers saying, well, the sales has held up and the inventories have been right sized, and that inventory destock is behind them. But there were other customers saying kind of the opposite, that they're seeing really cautious consumer behavior and their inventories are still at an elevated level. And it probably just sort of breaks down into, is it kind of the less elastic things that people need versus the kind of furniture and clothing and things that can be put off? I mean, you sort of think about some of these big box retailers, and like Walmart, for instance, has done a nice job drawing down inventories. Now, they were way too high a year ago, made a lot of progress in the last year. But some of these other things that are more discretionary in nature, still probably a little bit higher. Their issue all year has been sort of the bid compliance with, shippers having a hard time predicting their level of needs for capacity. You do have a sonar chart on domestic containerized volume, which is our O-rail DOML chart, and if we could bring that up, what that shows is, in the white line is 2023 volume, and it's that comp versus a year ago, which is 2022, has improved, as it's gone through, but still, not seeing evidence that there's going to be another peak. You see in that orange line in 2020, there was a really strong peak at the end of the year. I should mention these are 53-foot loaded containers, so exactly the market that JB Hunt participates in. So saw a strong peak in 2020, saw a strong peak also in 2021. You see that blue line, how that persisted. Those volumes persisted throughout November, which is a little bit unusual, and then had another surge in December. And last year was, kind of the opposite, where it was kind of reverse seasonality, where early in 2022, volumes were strong. They tailed off towards the end of the year with the decline in import volume. I have another sonar chart on intermodal rates, which is another one that sort of is very related to some of the trends that JB Hunt was discussing last week, where not a lot of intermodal volume moves on the spot market, but those rates, there's still information in that in that data, where when the railroads and the intermodal companies are concerned with securing capacity for the big contractual shippers, those rates will rise as we head closer to peak season, like they did in 2020 there in orange, or in 2021 in green. But this year, looking a little bit more like 2022, where those rates were falling as we get closer to peak season, still above where they were in 2019. I think a lot of that has to do with higher costs throughout the network. but still, you sort of look at that data, and the average intermodal spot rate that we have over 100 lanes, $1.65. That's including fuel, and that's door to door. So that's really a depressed rate. Suggests that if someone wanted to move intermodal on the spot market, they could do so at a pretty reasonable rate. And both of those things, I think, translate to this next sonar chart that I have, which is the intermodal contract rates. If we could bring that up, shows that those rates have, after rising double digits from 2020 in orange to 2021 in green, and then again in 2022 in blue, have gone the other way this year. What tends to happen with these rates is if there's a strong peak season the prior fall, they tend to rise. When the contracts come up for renewal, hasn't happened this year. They have been kind of down in the first, let's say the first quarter a little bit, the second quarter a little bit more, and then the third quarter we're kind of flat with where we were in the second quarter. Most of those contracts have been repriced in the current loose freight market. So that's a little bit of where we are. And, JB Hunt says that we still have about 15 to 20% excess capacity. It's pretty similar to what they said when they reported their first quarter numbers back in April. So not a lot has changed there in terms of capacity availability over the last 4 months or so. So still should be pretty easy for shippers to get things moved, really both on the highway and via rail intermodal.
Yeah, that's it sounds kind of like a glass half empty, half full. Like you're depending on depending on who you're talking to in terms of uh, yeah.
So the good news is if you're on the shipper side, not only have the rates come down, but the service levels have really improved. I mean, whenever I'm involved with someone that speak with someone who does intermodal on one of these shows for FreightWaves, I always ask them how rail service is, and I would say the last 5, 6, 7 times they've been pretty complimentary on rail service, particularly CSX and even Norfolk Southern has gotten a lot better when you look at some of the data from the Surface Transportation Board, which is now collecting that data on a weekly basis for things like intermodal delay days. I've heard some that BNSF has lagged a little bit, and maybe there's some issues now too with Hurricane Hillary, which is something I wanted to ask you about. You wrote up a report on Hurricane Hillary and how that has disrupted rail service in the Yuma subdivision. So that's in the Mojave. So out west, what's happening out there, flooding and so forth.
Yeah. So initially, at the start of the week, there are two subdivisions that were out, or at least portions of the subdivisions that were out. Both, Southern California. Yeah, or well, yeah, California. One is Yuma, and the other one was the Mojave subdivision. And both were, of course, impacted by Tropical Storm Hillary. And the Mojave subdivision was able to, UP was able to clear that a little sooner. So it's actually reopened, although there's still some delays from that. And it was interesting because I didn't realize BNSF actually helped out with that one as well, because they used some of UP's tracks in the Mojave subdivision. So they had also mentioned on Monday that they might also have some residual delays. The Yuma subdivision, they had pictures on UP's customer notifications, which were it was kind of pretty not very pretty. There's just a lot of mud and water over some of the tracks, and so there's a bridge that needs some repair work done, and it's a double tracking bridge. So they were able to get one track open, I think, yesterday, but the other track still needs to be worked on, and it might take about 2 weeks. And so UP said to continue to expect delays, so thankfully it's there is some movement happening, but of course you want to get that other track ready and restored and safe. So that's what's going on right now at the moment. But it looks like then of course there was the storm in Texas as well, and I think there were some tracks that were underwater too. But now seems to be UP said that the services has opened there, and and that things are kind of moving along. So
Mhm.
still, weather's still a big issue.
Yeah, all these weather events that get more and more
Mhm.
extreme. It seems like I don't think that's our imagination. I think the weather events really are getting more extreme. But that's good, at least on the surface. I mean, at least in that Yuma subdivision, they have one of the tracks open. Maybe that leads to some delays, but it's not going to be, as bad as it was if the entire, main line was shut down. Speaking of something that's maybe not as bad as maybe feared initially, Greg Miller wrote up a good article in the last day or two. Shipping traffic jam at the Panama Canal was maybe a little bit overblown. There's a picture of Greg's article. He follows the maritime industry, and so he heard a lot about Panama Canal, low water issues, and he says it's not a crisis. I don't know if we're going to go as far as to say it's much ado about nothing, but at least as far as the Asia-U.S. container trade, that's high value, important freight that's time sensitive for the most part, not having the same degree of disruption as maybe we would have thought. He goes into talking about how what the impact has actually been, and it's been essentially less throughput. So instead of moving 36 containers and across 36 container ships across certain blocks, it's gone to 32. Instead of 26, it's gone to 22 or 23. So the shippers and analysts don't seem that they have seen a big impact to that just yet. So I'd encourage people to go to FreightWaves and read that article for all the detail. And anything what are you working on now from the latest and for the articles that you do in the
Yeah,
next
yeah,
week?
yeah. So I'll give a little preview here. We're going to have a Q&A posted either tomorrow or Monday, for now, where I interview Jay O'Neill, who is a consultant now, but was with Kansas State for many years. He specializes in the grain markets and ag markets, and just kind of getting his thoughts on sort of grain outlook, not necessarily for this harvest 2023-2024 season, but kind of looking more on the 3 to 5 year range. And it was interesting how you're talking about intermodal. Granted, I know intermodal and grain carloads are kind of two different things, but there were some similarities in the sense of having that unpredictability in terms of like grain shippers needing to know, trying to figure out how much what their needs will be, and sort of that dance that shippers and the railroads do in terms of like trying to figure out like forecasts, but at the same, so you don't want to have not enough, you don't want to have too much, and that kind of thing. But
Mhm.
actually, it's the second story I was working on about grain. But the Q&A though is about looking at grain exports, U.S. grain exports mainly, but also Canada too. In the next 3 to 5 years, and what global shifts might occur that might result in fewer grain exports, but then there's also going to be an anticipated increase in domestic production of biofuels. So what does that mean, or biodiesel? So what do those two things mean for rail? If you have fewer, I mean, there's always going to be a demand to export grain, but if you have less volume and less demand for bulk grain moving to the ports for export,
Mhm.
but then you have a greater need to to get feedstock to biodiesel facilities. What is that? What would that look like for rail? So that'll be coming out. It's a little preview coming out sometime in the next several days.
It seems like that would be a negative for BNSF if we're
Mm-hmm.
using more grain for biodiesel, because they do so much from the heartland to the Pacific
Mm-hmm.
Northwest. and that's really good freight for them. That a lot of that gets exported, so that'll be interesting to see if that comes to
Yeah.
fruition.
Yeah, it was interesting because he said that like this year was this Mr. Nail said like this year was kind of really strange because there was actually a point where the railroads, well, he according to him, the railroads were really asking to move freight from the Midwest, grain from the Midwest to the ports, and had set rates that were really attractive for shippers to get that grain moving. Because
Mhm.
then I guess the larger issue too is like, if the grain movement's changed, so what does that mean for your crew resources, and how you deploy crews, and where do you deploy them, and where do you deploy power and locomotives? So and which rail cars will you be using the railroads rail cars, or will it be like, will a lot of the rail cars come from private shippers? So yeah, so it's interesting times.
Okay, so encourage everyone to read that article when it comes out and learn a little bit about grain and on the rail. And while you're there, go down to the bottom of the article and sign up. Click the link to sign up for the FreightWaves Rail newsletter. And with that, hope everyone has a good day.